Week 2 preseason action, Dolphins fans. We are in Houston this week for the game against the Texans. Obviously, earlier this week had a couple of joint practices, and now we get like the national televised NFL Network game starting at 4 o'clock Eastern time. So if you're looking for that, NFL Network 4 p.m. But just like we did last week, leading up to that Falcons game, going to talk about the game, but rather than doing like an actual game preview, because win losses preseason, don't necessarily care. I'm all about individual players, who's getting the snaps on first team, second team, third team, and how are they doing with those snaps, and how do they look playing with the teammates that they're doing. So I want to focus more so on three individual players. Obviously, throughout the game, I'm going to be watching the roster top to bottom. But at the end of the day, these are a couple of guys that I've really got my eye on, that I'm really hoping to see something from as we take on the Houston Texans. But like I said, plenty more options besides the three that I'm going to talk about. So that's where you come in. Drop the guys that you're going to be having that extra eye on in the comments. Let's carry on the conversation there leading up to game time. Last week, I went with Peely, Ezukama, Channing Tindall. Turned out to be kind of solid calls. And like I said, it's not like I'm picking the guys that I think are going to do well. It's just guys that got my eye on and I want to see a little something from. And all three of those guys came through last week. I'm not going to do any repeat performances. Preseason's only 3 game. We're going to talk about 3 different players each week. So let's see how we do this week against the Houston Texans. And number one, Kendall Lamm, and it's probably an obvious reason that I'm going to get to as to why Kendall Lamm is one of my top 3 this week. But if you look at who the Dolphins held out last week, just from like a pure like safety standpoint, they didn't basically play any starters, very few starters, I should say, and then a couple of key backups. Well, Kendall Lamm was one of those guys that was held up, which kind of tells you if something were to happen to Terron Armstead, speaking in the past, obviously here, or if we need a backup offensive lineman to step in at some point in time, well, Kendall Lamm has had a pretty strong training camp so far. He is potentially one of those guys. Now let's fast forward to where we are right now with Terron Armstead having the knee injury in the joint practice. And now, yeah, saying that it's not anything super serious and his goal is to be there for week 1. Well, geez, do you really want to rush him back? Do you want him to be 100% healthy before he gets back onto the field? Because we got to have the long game in mind with a guy like Terron Armstead. We can't be rushing him back. Obviously, we want him out there. We want our best guys out there. But if someone else needs to start the season at left tackle, or if Terron Armstead comes back and God forbid something else happens, we're going to need a backup plan. And right now, the name that you're looking at is definitely one of the top 1 to 2 probably candidates for that job. So obviously, if he gets run on Saturday against the Texans, whether it's blocking for Tua, for Skyler, for Mike White, opening lanes in the running game, that's what I want to see. Opening those lanes, protecting those quarterbacks, not allowing the sacks, the hurries, the pressures, just looking the part. Because quite honestly, if Terron Armstead isn't healthy, or if we need someone to fill in at some point in time, we need that guy to look that part, because this team is going to go as far as Tua takes us, and the offensive line is going to be a big part of as to where Tua can take us as well. So let's see some production. Let's see. Doesn't necessarily need to be flawless play, but Jesus, let's look the part. Let's go on to my second guy here. It's Elijah Higgins, who had a couple of moments in that first game against the Falcons. 2 catches, 36 yards. If you remember, his catches actually came on back-to-back plays. But the one that stood out, and the thing that we've been craving from the tight end position, yards after the catch. And that's exactly what he did on that first catch. I think it was like the 26-yard catch that he had in that game against the Falcons. So I loved to see that. That's an aspect from the tight end position that we have been lacking for quite some time. But the other thing that I liked and stood out, and it's kind of weird to say this because it technically was a penalty, was he had that holding call. In my opinion, if you could review penalties in the NFL, that looked like a pretty damn good block, in my opinion. And it's the block where Skylar Thompson was scrambling, made it around the outside, would have got the first down. Obviously, got flagged for the holding. It doesn't look that way on the stat sheet. But regardless, I want to see some more of that. Not holding. I want to see quality blocking. And I want to see, when your number is called, continue to make those plays in the passing game. Because if you look at our tight end crew right now, and you got Durham Smythe, who's kind of like the unquestioned starter because he's been here for so long. And you know what you're going to get from him? in what Mike McDaniel considers to be the most important aspect of that position, which is obviously blocking. Pass protection, run blocking. That's what Durham Smythe does. And Durham Smythe is kind of like a safety valve when it comes to pass catching. We're not, no teams are game planning against Durham Smythe. Let's put it that way. But it was interesting to note that earlier this week, I think it was Wednesday's joint practice, one of the beat reporters had made note of like Durham Smythe caught more passes in this one practice than he had in probably all the training camp practices combined. So it's kind of like the Dolphins are like training him to be like, dude, you're going to be on the field a lot. We might need to count on you a little bit more in these situations. Let's get a few more reps. But if you look outside of Durham Smythe, what tight end has stepped up? And quite honestly, it's a big question mark at this point in time, which makes you think there's opportunities out there for a tight end 2, for a tight end 3 to emerge and really not only earn a spot on the 53-man roster. Because you look at Elijah Higgins, a 6th-round pick, former NFL or a former collegiate wide receiver converting to tight end. When you draft him, you don't necessarily think his roster spot is even a guaranteed thing. Well, I think he's shown enough now where he makes the 53-man roster, but now we're kind of looking beyond that. And it's if Durham Smythe is tight end 1, who's going to be tight end 2? Who's going to be called upon when we need those pass catching opportunities? Who can step in and block? Because we know that's why Durham Smythe is out there as well. So can Elijah Higgins, when his number gets called, if he's inserted into a real game, can he be relied on in that blocking, in the pass protection, in the run game, when his number is called as a pass catcher? We don't have quite as many doubts about that. But when the lights come on, can you do it? So this is another opportunity on Saturday to go out there and just show, you know what, this is a wide open position. I'm going to make my stamp on it. Let's go to my third guy here. And this one is, like I said, I talked about having Peely as one of my picks last week, and he's kind of tied to this pick because if you look at what Jalen Twyman did last week, I'll get to Peely here in a minute. 3 tackles, 1 sack, 1 tackle for a loss. So he did pretty well in that preseason opener against the Falcons. But we talked about Peely, Brandon Peely, and that injury that he has. I don't have any updates as to what his status is right now. But man, Peely was that undrafted free agent that was like, you don't want to call someone that's an undrafted free agent a lock to make the team's final 53-man roster, but signs were pointing up that, man, he looked the part. Because I always talk about the big 3 when it comes to the interior defensive linemen. And it's Raekwon Davis, it's Zach Sealer, and it's Christian Wilkins. Like those are your core. Those are the guys that are going to get the most snaps. But what happens if something happens to one of those guys injury-wise? And you know that you need depth, especially at that interior defensive line when you're constantly taking that beating, that pounding. Well, we brought in Deshaun Hand, and he's had some nice reps. He looked pretty good in that preseason game, and he's done pretty well in training camp. But you still might need another guy outside of that. And guess who is kind of left now that Brandon Peely, and like I said, who knows what's going to end up happening with him health-wise. I hope that Peely can continue to potentially be in the mix yet this year, but since I don't know injury-wise where that's at, I'm shifting my focus a little bit here to Jalen Twyman. But you gotta come in and you gotta show that you can compete with Deshaun Hand because yeah, he's the veteran. He's the guy that's going to be probably counted on for these snaps. But if you want to make the roster, you got to back up what you did the week 1, which is, like I said, the 3 tackles, the sack, the tackle for a loss, but clogging that middle, being able to penetrate if it's an obvious passing down. Just show that you belong, especially with the absence of Brandon Peely right now, at least for the time being. But those are the 3 guys, like I said, I got my eye on everyone, but those are the 3 that I wanted to single out for today's video. But I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts, drop your top 3 guys, however many guys you want to add. I won't limit you in the comments. Let's carry on the conversation there. But that's what I've got. I will check back in with you following the game against the Texans. But until then, Dolphins fans, fins up.